And we're back. You're listening to Anchored and Devoted.
You love it. We love you.
This is Pastor Jer.
This is Pastor Joseph. Welcome back.
Welcome back. We're good to go. So we're going to jump in to our second round at talking about just war theory and how we respond to aggressive acts around us in the world, as well as how we think through as Christians on how we as citizens can respond and how we as the body of Christ ought to be responding to a world where there is still tremendous upheaval from war. Right. So we hit this once already, way back in the first episode of the season. And honestly, as we're recording this, we're recording this on the day that first episode dropped. Dave and I both listened to it and we're like, you know what, we should probably hit this again.
Yes.
So we may actually, drop this a little earlier in the season than it would be if we were to drop it in line now. But there were a couple questions that, as we were going through listening to today's episode for, in real time.
Again, that's May the, what is
May the 2nd.
May the 2nd. There you go.
Yeah.
The first episode.
There were a couple questions that we didn't touch at all. And there was certainly more that we could be discussing here. So with that, we're going to dive in and hopefully not take too terribly long.
We'll see. No promises.
Yeah.
This isn't Daily Games where we're trying to rush it. So I'd rather at least answer the questions we missed the last time somewhat. And if it requires a third hit, then we'll, come at it again.
For sure. So just to kind of lay a foundation again, we did discuss the position of the church. The mandate of the church is to love. The mandate of Christians is to love. That is to be our primary motivation. We discussed that there is a place for the intentional taking of life. It resides within particular spheres of authority, specifically when you're talking about a national group, the national government, whether it's for crimes or in declaring war and intentionally taking the life in wartime. That is something that resides with government. That doesn't reside with you and me as citizens to decide this is an appropriate time to intentionally take a life. We also briefly touched on the concept that the just way, the righteous way to engage in warfare is from a defensive posture. We didn't go into it very deeply, but to put that in really simple terms, just war theory states pretty broadly and pretty succinctly that it is not just if I am the aggressor. So we started this talking about Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For any nation to invade another nation for the purpose of grabbing resources, grabbing land, toppling a government, that is by definition unjust.
Well, see, right there, let's pause because you're giving the basis for stating that something is almost unfair. You're saying, okay, I have resources and you're taking them. And this is the playground rules we talked about last time.
Right.
Right. Like, this isn't right when someone steals your cookies. Like, it's just not okay. Just like if they steal your goldfish crackers, not okay. Something's wrong here. Every kid can figure this out. When we start talking about a spiritual side, and I know I'm already distracting us because you still got your questions. But the spiritual side, we haven't really talked about that when it comes to, as we see in the Old Testament, where there is a people that God wants to do something with. Example, humble Israel, right? He wants to humble Israel. He's made it very clear. You all have stepped out of line. This is part of your cycle. I'm going to call a different group of people to come in and hand it to you for a little bit.
Right.
I need to humble you. And yes, this is war. And by our standards, we would say it is not because we don't know the heart of the individuals who are attacking. All we know is God is saying clearly these people are going to come and they're going to take over. In our conversation right now, we have the understanding, at least the thought that we know the reason behind it. And so I just wanted to hit a pause there and even caution, like, hey, we might not know. And we might have to ask the question, like, what is the reason that this war is being started? whether it's from an American standpoint or from a Russian standpoint or some other standpoint. Like, we assume we know what the president's thinking is. And, in my opinion, unless he states it, we have to go with what he states. Even if his actions don't match up with what he states, this is what he's telling us. Okay, sorry about that.
So is there a question there?
No. It wasn't a question. It was just more a pause. Like, hey, you hit on the.
You're pointing out that I'm making assumptions.
Right. There is something that has to be clear when it comes to the ethics and morality of war. We understand that, hey, you don't get to pick on kids or you don't get to blow up orphanages. We know these things are wrong because these are innocents, right? They can't do anything. The reality of God seeing through time and into the lives of every individual in that space is something that we just don't do. We don't have that ability to do. And so we must engage with God, one, and also engage with those who are declaring the war or receiving it to try and understand what their perspective is, because it matters. It's not just me as an outsider determining that this is unjust because I don't like it.
So let me ask you this, because I think I'm tracking with you, but I want to make sure.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like what you're saying is that it's not simply a matter of deciding this was an invasion, therefore it's unjust. Maybe you can do that, maybe you can't. But what you're saying, it's not just what was done, but how it was done from both sides.
Correct.
I have to look at this as an outsider I'm not the aggressor. I'm not the one being attacked either. I'm on the outside. And I'm going to draw conclusions. I have to draw conclusions because I'm not God.
Right.
So at some level, I have to engage with this and be able to ask the question, what was done? Is the reason this was done a sufficient reason? And if it is the way it was done an appropriate way to do it?
Right.
Okay. I'm tracking.
Yeah. So example, Good Samaritan story. We come up on the Good Samaritan. We assume everything. We assume that the bad guys are still around. We assume this could be a trap. We assume I need to stay holy and not touch a person who might be dead and keep walking. Like, we assume a whole bunch of stuff, but it isn't until we get close to actually have a relationship with the individual that we realize, oh no, he's only half dead. Let me throw him on my horse and take him into town and drop him off at the motel, whatever.
He's only mostly dead.
Exactly. There you go. that was a joke for those of you who watch the movie, and now I can't remember the name of it.
Princess Bride.
There it is. So anyway, it requires engagement to understand what's taking place, because there's often history and so much more that we just don't understand. And yes, we can say, hey, this is unjust just looking at it. But that doesn't mean that I saw the punch from yesterday.
Right.
Right. And it doesn't make this response, right? We're talking about little kids. I've got a 7-year-old who goes to the playground. He tells me that his kid's been making faces at another kid. And how does the kid respond? He kicks him in the crotch. This is real life. This is kind of first grade at a Christian school. And is that response appropriate? No. Has this kid been warned 20 times? Yes. So when we talk about the justness of it, there was a response that should have been had, but that wasn't the proper one. And so you end up with 2 kids being expelled as opposed to one being corrected and class moving forward. Like, that's what I'm leaning into. It's okay, before we get into the real weeds of just war, we do have to understand that there is eternity relationships in 2 groups that are engaging, where we have to talk to them first before we can just say, oh, this is just versus unjust. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
That was my spiel, my random spiel for today. Did it last time. I'm doing it again. Here we go.
Now we're in it. And this is what makes it difficult, right? So the whole idea, the basis for just war theory coming out of Christian theology started way back in biblical times, in Roman times because Christians were being forced to serve in the Roman army.
Mm-hmm.
And the question was, can a Christian serve in the Roman army?
Right.
Can a Christian both be faithful to Christ and his teachings, and also not just swear the allegiance to Caesar that was necessary to serve in the Roman army, but also carry out the orders of Caesar when those orders many times are at least not in alignment with, and many times in opposition to, the very clear teaching of Christ, as we see, as you're touching back on it several times now, in the Good Samaritan, the first commandment, love the Lord your God, and the second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It is really difficult to love your neighbor as yourself when you're sniping at them with a whatever kind of rifle you have. Those two things are pretty, if in a Venn diagram, there's not in the overlap section,
There's not. There
are many things that we can agree on, I think, when it comes to just war theory, whether we're looking at it from a Christian perspective or a non-Christian perspective. A simple one: you should only engage. Aggression should only be taken against military combatants. Now, military can be described in terms of either an official army or a guerrilla army, those who have taken up arms for the purpose of protection or invasion, whatever it is. If someone has taken up arms against me, essentially they fall into the area of fair game. But, and this is, I'm coming back to this because we've already touched on it several times. If we're talking about women and children, this falls into the category of, have they taken up arms against you? Is this a child soldier who has been kidnapped at the age of 9, has been brutalized, and then handed a rifle and told to go kill you? If that's on the extreme end, because most oftentimes, if you're talking about children in war, you're not talking about child soldiers.
Oh, it's still talking.
You're talking about kids who are merely bystanders, merely collateral damage. And when you use warfare, when you use innocent lives to cause casualties, to win a war, that is considered to be out of bounds. I mean, it's, if you and I are having a fight, Dave,
Mm-hmm.
and I turn in order to win this fight, and I start punching down on your son,
Mm-hmm.
we all recognize, whether we're looking at it from a Christian perspective or not, that's out of bounds. Now,
Right.
That hasn't always been the case, right?
Well, see, and this is where we're making the distinction between just war. I'd say in even certain places, still not the case.
No, I agree.
When we are very, and I'm Navy, go Navy, beat Army. I love my people, love my tribe. My sister-in-law is a lawyer, and for the longest time, under multiple presidents, her job as a human rights lawyer, not a social justice, but human rights lawyer, was to advocate for those who had lost family members or loved ones due to U.S. misfires, ordnance being placed in the wrong place, again, rockets landing at weddings and other things. And that's hard because it's, as we're talking about it, the goal was always to protect and to do it with the least amount of casualties. And yet, those individuals on the ground now have a reason to go to war because they've lost family, like they were doing nothing. And they were never the target, but yet they ended up losing their lives. That is one of those things where, especially when we look at the Old Testament, you see those individuals who accidentally killed someone fleeing to this town of grace and mercy and being cared for and being told, don't leave this space. We don't have that in our world right now. And because of that, we see individuals who choose their own definition when it comes to war, what's fair and what isn't fair. And for some, picking up a kid who is named after me and trying to destroy them would be considered fair.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm driving through certain areas of the country and I bump into a person who thinks that I'm less than, getting rid of my kid is viewed as an easy thing. That's not viewed as a less than thing. That's viewed as fair. That's war. Versus viewing and this is why last episode we talked about the image of God so much, seeing that. And so when we as believers look at war, yes, I'm looking at my enemy from a different lens. There are certain things, certain lines, as you're stating, Jer, the taking of life of what I would consider innocents, those who are non-combatants.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of those things where, again, we're not looking at the spiritual side. We're just looking at the physical right now. That is a no-go. And that was one of my concerns, even with the war in Ukraine. It wasn't just for women and children. It was also for men.
Right.
You're getting bread and then all of a sudden tanks are rolling in. Like, huh?
Right.
This wasn't one of those things where you had, like with North and South Korea today, where there are literally two armed sides and one side says, yeah, I'm going to attack, and the other side is ready for an attack. It wasn't that. This was people knowing that Russia could come in, but also knowing that they could be saying, they've been saying, this is, practice. This is what we're doing. We're just doing our practice in your backyard.
Right.
And so just for me, when it comes from a biblical standpoint, as I look at 1 Corinthians 9 and being able to understand that I surrender my rights to God and surrender my rights to those in authority above me because God has put them in positions of authority, is one where I'm truly believing that God is in charge and I don't need to be in charge. I need to follow him. And I need to live in a way that causes people to come to know him. And so when I think of the person across who is, as you stated, sniping at me, and there's no way for me to get Jesus to them outside of sending him or her to meet him. This is where that line is, I believe, right? Like the line is, I can't communicate with this person. That wall has broken down, and now we're at a space where it really is war. Like we're at a space where the only way to engage with this person is through power. And that is difficult for most because we want to assume that we can rationalize. Again, we're being in charge. We can talk our way out of it. When it comes to just war, the assumption is that can't happen. This is real. The person on the other side of the table views me differently than themselves. And that makes it clear, as you stated earlier, when we start with a defensive posture, I need to be able to engage with this individual in a way that repels them, pushes them back, allows them to understand that this isn't okay.
And for a good read on that, you can read Boundaries.
Yes.
Because it's essentially the same thing. But we haven't really walked through this, but the fact is, you pointed it out, what we are saying here coming out of just war theory is not universally held and has not been universally held. In fact, it is a new invention that grew out of Christianity and was applied predominantly in areas where Christianity had already had a major impact in shaping the society.
And hadn't played by these rules with the Crusades or other wars where you just go, okay, we want to hold by these rules, but these aren't the rules we just beat you by. Just keeping it real. Like it's not. So when you know a history, you go, okay, we are the church, and as Christians, if we're going to hold to this, we really have to hold to it.
which is tough. And there's no question about it. It's really tough when we look at an idea like total war versus just war. Total war, which a lot of the history that I've read says really started in World War II. We had precursors to it in Sherman's March to the Sea, where as he went, he torched everything that they passed.
Yeah.
And his rationale was, this is war material. If we leave it here, it's going to be used by the forces whom are seeking to defeat us. By torching this, we are going to take away the ability for this war to continue. Mm-hmm. And there is a rationale there. I can't look at that and say, well, that doesn't make sense. I can't look at that and say, well, I wouldn't do similarly. I can't look at that and say, well, this is the same as taking lives, or this is the same as killing the farmers who own these farms or work these farms. There is a distinction. When we get to even going further back from that to many of the wars in Europe fought during the Napoleonic era, there was still there was a sense in which there was a split between the country at war and the territory that was being fought over. Mm-hmm. There was still foraging that was going on. There was still taking of the fields and of the goods of the people whom you were fighting against, even though they weren't combatants. But there was also, at least in the histories that I've read, a distinction between what is fair and appropriate and what is not fair or appropriate. And many times what was not fair and what was not appropriate was still permitted by people who were not operating to the standard that they were, at least their superiors, were promoting as being appropriate standards. But again, to say that there are standards of warfare to which one should abide presupposes that there is a moral imperative. Mm-hmm. And the moral imperative comes out of the Christian worldview. To expect that someone who rejects the Christian worldview, regardless of whether they are atheist or a different religion, to expect that they would hold to this same view is a deluded hope. And it will lead to being very unprepared for the reality of the world in which you live. Example here. If I, as a Christian, believe that I should not steal from my neighbor, and my neighbor, being a heathen, says, hey, I know the law says I shouldn't steal from my neighbor, but there's no Ring camera and he's not here right now, so yoink. Okay. If I, being aware that we have two different starting points on what is acceptable, on whether or not there is a moral imperative, whether or not there is a lawgiver to whom I'm going to give account, whether or not I am responsible to recognize the value of my neighbor, I'm responsible to live under the reality that this person is an image bearer of God, that I'm going to give an account for the way I treat them, whether or not I have loved them. If I, as a Christian, don't recognize that they're not living in that same worldview or out of that same worldview, I'm going to live with them differently than if I do. If I'm living next door to you and I know you and I share the same worldview, I can be very free to not have my camera pointed at your yard, making sure you don't hop the fence to grab my Troy belt or whatever. Mm-hmm. If then you move out and the neighbor moves in and I don't know where their worldview is, but I assume, I was living next door to Dave and it was perfectly fine. I never had any problems. I'll just continue operating this way. And all of a sudden my Troy belt and my whatever start disappearing. And my neighbor starts ending up with the same things in his yard instead. If I don't then shift my response to say, you know what, this is a different situation. We're starting from two different points. I now need to put up my defenses, put them further out than I did with Dave in order to protect myself, because we're not operating on the same frequency here. I'm saying there are things I won't do. This other person is not holding to the same standard.
And I would say for the new believer as well as for the well-seasoned believer, what is not being said in our conversation, and now it is that much of what should take place has to be done with prayer. I know we said that in the last episode on Just War as well. Our lives belong to God, and so the loss of it is not the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things where we hold it dear to ourselves because it's the one we have. But if we genuinely believe in him and we believe that we're pilgrims, then even the stuff that my neighbor wants to liberate from my yard is not worth this neighbor going to hell. Now, God has made it clear that there are broken vessels, and we are them, but there are also some for use and some for disuse. And so there are those individuals who are not going to come to know him.
Right.
And just like there are those individuals who are determined to go to war. Even though their neighbor isn't bothering them in the moment, they just want to be advantageous. They've got the toys, let's do it. The reality is that our heart, as you stated, is starting from a different point. That doesn't mean that we are to be oblivious to the fact that there are individuals who God has made broken.
Right.
That they will not choose. So you've shared Christ, you've been loving, you've tried. It's been a couple of years now. You've seen your rims end up on your neighbor's car. You've made it clear, like, hey, you don't have to steal. I'm happy to give them to you. I bought 3 Weber grills, 2 of them in your backyard, 1's in mine. How about we just call it a community pool? Like I'm trying my best. I'm not viewing myself as a doormat here, but I am working with the blessings. God has blessed me, so I'm not going to view it as such a great thing. But I am going to say, as you stated, Jer, that there is a boundary that has been crossed. Like we have gotten to that space where boundaries need to be respected. And the crossing of the boundaries need to be understood. What is the response? And that's how just war theory comes out. Like, what is the response when boundaries are broken, relationship has been broken? And as we've talked about, life for the individual has been changed. Whether it's you losing your grill and I have to go buy another one, my life has been changed. My account has been changed because of this person. Mm-hmm. Tanks roll into my neighborhood. I got to pay taxes on those roads. Even if you don't blow nothing up, just that alone is enough. But worse, you've again taken life. You've caused people to leave and move and do other things. And so justice requires that there be a response. And war, unfortunately, is the response because that's what has been called for. You've called for war, so the response is to match that, to make it clear that this is not okay. That not okay requires us to do things that are uncomfortable.
It does.
It requires us to do things.
And not just in the moment. It requires us to do things that are uncomfortable beforehand. And
after, if we're being wise, right? If we're being wise, this will require a shift in how people engage with one another, whether it's keeping the lines of communication open afterwards, so that this doesn't happen again. But as you stated beforehand, I can't trust you now, and building trust is a process. But know that in the midst of war, the goal is to get to a space where we're stopping.
Right.
And so with just war, when the boundaries have been broken, we respond in a way that causes the other army to recoil, or Air Force, Navy, whatever, to stop. And that's hard when we know that lives are being lost on the other side and we want them to be saved. The issue is we often put ourselves first in that want when we know that God's in charge. I'm not causing them to take their lives. They've broken the rules as far as stepping over the country line. Right. And that was their choice then. Any of them could have turned around. Any of them could have, stop their tanks at the border. Like there's a number of things the individual can do. It's still a choice to obey. And my challenge for us today is, who do we obey? Or are we just obeying ourselves and therefore fighting unjustly as opposed to a just war? Now, I know you had some questions and we still got to get to them, and I keep interrupting by side rabbit trails and everything else.
No, I think this is a good place to land because I've got a scripture.
Oh, okay.
And this is a big topic, but James talks about this when he says, "Where do wars and fights come from among you? They come from your desires. You want and you don't have. You desire and you don't get, and so you kill and you steal. And you want what you want, but you want it so that you can use it on yourselves." Ultimately, this comes down to whether we're talking about an individual basis and two citizens going to fisticuffs with each other, or we're talking about two nations or multiple nations throwing down over whatever the issue may be. There's a question that we have to ask ourselves from the outset. And as we're diagnosing this, as we're doing a postmortem, what was the desire that was apparent here, or that is apparent, and that was apparently being thwarted or unmet? And it was that desire. Whether or not it's understandable, was it legitimate? And was it pursued in a legitimate way? If not, if the answer is no, this is an illegitimate desire, then it's upon me as the person with the desire to use self-control and self-restraint.
Mm-hmm.
And if it is legitimate desire, it is still upon me as the person with the legitimate desire to only use appropriate methods of achieving that desired end. And if I don't do those things, I'm crossing the boundary. I'm inviting you to respond with force.
Correct. You've broken out of community.
That's huge to understand that what we're talking about is living within community, that there's a separation between you and me as an individual. And we can only live in community if we respect those appropriate boundaries and if we engage with them to cross through them in ways that are appropriate, in ways that are mutually agreed upon and righteous. I don't simply get to walk into your house whenever I want to, sit down on your couch and start eating food out of your fridge. If you were a single man, we might have that relationship. But you've got a wife and two kids. For me to walk into your house whenever I want to would be wholly inappropriate. The relationship changed because the community around you changed. And that's not a bad thing.
No.
The question is, will we love each other enough to live that way with each other? And will we trust God enough to be able to respond appropriately when we have been aggressed against, or when we see others being aggressed against? Now, again, there's so many different things we haven't hit.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay. It's an ongoing discussion. I guess my hope here is not so much that we will answer questions, but that we will be thinking through, and that you, the listener, will be engaging with this. Where do you agree? Where do you disagree? Where have we not gone far enough? Where have we gone too far in our comments here? I'd love to get your feedback and continue this conversation, because it's one that sadly we're going to continue to need to have until Christ returns. We're going to need to be wrestling through these issues and determining how we can walk faithfully with our God and with our brothers. Whether our brothers are next door to us and of the same faith, or whether they are across the world and only our brothers because they are part of the human race, because they are God's creation, imbued with His image.
Okay. Well, thanks for tuning in again. This is AMD, Pastor Joseph and Pastor Jerry. You have a blessed one. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.